Great. Next, you ask tough questions, so be prepared. So there will be some revenge. So next, I would like to invite Dr. Thanh Tu Anh from the Fulbright School. He's here in the U.S. at Princeton University, working on a very boring topic, which is the political economy of Vietnam's industrial growth. And actually, it's a fascinating and challenging topic. So I'm very glad that I agree and to come here and join us this time.
Thank you, Ngọc Anh, and the organizer for giving me an opportunity to speak today. And it's always tough to speak after Eddie, but I try my best. I'm going to start by saying that Vietnam's industrial development in the last 25 years has been a success by almost any standard. If you take the period between 1986 to 2012, which is the most recent years where the data is available in the systematic manners, the industrial growth in Vietnam is about 8.6% on average over that period. Or if it take a whole, the production value, industrial production value has increased by 9 times. So, by that standard alone, Vietnam has been a success. In addition to that, if you look at the manufacturing sectors, the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector in Vietnam has been significantly improved. And then if you look at the export, the manufacturing export in Vietnam has been greatly diversified. So if you compare with other countries with the same level of development, Vietnam is clearly a success. But I'm going to argue that that success is a partial one. It's not a complete success. If you compare to China, after 20 years of reform, China average industrial growth was about 11%, compared with Vietnam of 8.6%. Very similar picture that David Davis has presented this morning. So the question is why? So that's the question that I'm going to try to answer with the political economy analysis. And basically, there are many factors behind this performance. But I would like to argue that the relationship between the party states and the private sector in Vietnam is the key, and I want to emphasize, the key determinants of that performance. And I'm going to try to substantiate my analysis with the 3 generations of the enterprise law. Starting with the 1990 law on private enterprises and company law, moving to the 2nd generation of 1999 law on enterprise, and then the 2005 law on enterprise. The recent one, the 4th generation, that the National Assembly just passed the law on enterprise, in 2014, is too early to assess, so I'm not going to touch upon that. And my main argument is that being, a communist-oriented economies and adhering to the communist ideology, in Vietnam, it's not difficult for us to imagine that the private sectors has been discriminated, and there's a lot of distrust with respect to the private sectors. That's understandable. But then I would like to argue that the level or the degree of distrust and discrimination depends on several factors. The first one is the the trade-off between the political ideology on the one hand and economic legitimacy on the other hand. And this exactly that factors that produces the so-called dualism in Vietnam. All right, I'm going to illustrate that point later on. The second factor is the internal structure of the state itself. And the third one is the quality of leadership. I'm going to illustrate these 3 points, by looking at the 3 generations of the law on private enterprises in Vietnam. In the early 1980s, the Soviet-style centrally planned economy fell into a serious crisis, and we all know that. which challenges the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Under the leadership of Trường Trinh, there's so much misunderstanding right now that Nguyễn Văn Linh or Trường Trinh are the reformers. I know that the key the key leader to lead the reform. But I would argue that Trường Trinh is a person. Trường Trinh is a leader of that reform effort in Vietnam in '86, and in only 5 months after the death of Lê Duẩn, which is in the 12th of July in 1986, to the end of December, Trường Trinh led the group of reforms within the government, especially within his own team, to rewrite the whole political reform that opened up the economy to market-oriented reform. But he himself was a very indoctrinated, communist, but then turned reformers at the end of his life. And as we know, the private enterprises, both domestic and foreign, for the very first time in the Vietnamese economic history, in the modern Vietnamese economic history, become a sector of the economy. So the first ever formally recognized as an economic sector. Before, there's no such sector in Vietnam. And within only a decade, the foreign sectors surpassed the SOEs as the biggest contributors to industrial growth in Vietnam, only in 1 decade. And why that is the case? One argument is that because of their superior capacity. But the second argument that I would like to put forward is because of their political neutrality, so that it doesn't present as an immediate threat to the Communist Party and the Communist state. And then let's move to the second generation of the law on enterprise. In the late 1990s, Vietnam's economy once again faced serious difficulties, not to the extent of a crisis, but was sufficiently pressing for the party to be concerned about its performance legitimacy. So now you see there's another trade-off, not as serious as '86, but sufficient enough for the party to reconsider the situation. And again, the private sectors come to add an, kind of rescue to the situation. At the time, the Prime Minister Phan Văn Khải, a dedicated technocrat and a clean one, I would say, together with his group of reformers, with the PMRC, the Prime Minister Research Council, led by Trần Đức Nguyên and Việt Phương and others, and CIEM, led by Lê Đông Doanh at that point, as a two nucleus, successfully designed and implemented the 1999 law on enterprise. And the result is so astonishing, right? The private sector just blossomed, and after several years, the growth rate in terms of industrial development, in terms of industrial production of the private sectors, surpassed even the FDI sectors in just a couple of years. So you see the change in the relationship, the change in the law makes a huge difference in terms of the growth of the private sector in Vietnam, and therefore the growth of industrial production. And let's move to the 2005 generation of the law on enterprise. Unlike the first two generations of enterprise law, the 2005 law on enterprise was enacted during the peak of economic growth. In addition, the internal structure of the state had been altered by decentralization, and the status of the state economic groups, I call SEG in short, had been adjusted by the leadership. Change. We all know who replaced Phan Văn Khải. In terms of supervision, the SEGs have increasingly moved away from the line ministries toward the prime ministers, and those SEGs have even become the instruments for accumulating political support. That's the key thing that I want to emphasize. On the other hand, with the decentralization, the provinces now are competing with each other in terms of resources, in terms of performance, in terms of everything. That is the positive side. But the negative side is that the decentralizations make it easier for those who control the SOEs to use those SEGs, the bigger ones, the large economic groups, as investment vehicle to invest in provinces and thereby, buying political support. I think that's one of the key, takeaway from the lessons of decentralization in Vietnam. Consequently, while the local business climates have generally been improved across province, clientelism, and collusive behavior in the relationship between the state and business at both the central and local level becomes widespread. And here, FD is a person who knows very well about that. In the most recent PCI report, I'm going to quote, when about more than 8,000 private firms in Vietnam were asked following statement if they agree or not. The statement is contracts, land, and other economic resources mostly fall in the hands of enterprises that have strong connection to local authorities. That's the statement. And the private firms are asked to agree or not to agree. And the answer, the result is not surprising. On the median province, about 97% agree to that. So you see, now we are facing a completely different political economy now. That is the new political economy of Vietnam that developed in the 2000s until now. And we are going to see a far-reaching consequences down the road. Okay, let me end with two observations and two implications for my analysis. The first implication is that Vietnam's experience has been consistent with the stated literature in suggesting that the preconditions for sustained high growth of sustained high industrial growth in Vietnam and in elsewhere is that first the ruling elites need to form a close alliance with the most productive forces, build strong reform coalitions, the topics that Zhu mentioned, discussed this morning, and create a meritocratic bureaucracy, all of which are the usual suspects behind the success of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. In the Vietnamese case, now we look back at the Vietnamese case, because the alliance with the most dynamic and efficient sectors was viewed by many as a temporary concession, a step backward other than step forward. Then the success was only partial, more fundamentally because of the ideology and symbiotic economic relationship with the SOEs. The party has chosen to rely on the SOEs, which are persistently the least efficient sector in the economy. Additionally, the fragmentation of power and inherent lacks of effectiveness renders the state incapable of imposing hard budget constraints on the SOEs or sanction them for underperformance. Without effective stakes and an over-reliance on carrots of political support rather than development goals, the state-business relationship runs the risk of being degraded into clientelism and corruption, as I illustrated earlier. My last comment is with respect to the industrial policy. So in Vietnam, there has been a lot of discussion about how to shape the industrial policy. But from the analysis that I just discussed, I would argue that the most important industrial policy in Vietnam doesn't come from the industrial policy in a narrowly defined manner, or even from purely economic policy. It is a political, choice whether or not to be a friend of the private sectors or to be antagonistic to that. Vietnam wants to be a friend of everybody, but Vietnam needs to be a friend of its domestic company first in order to build up the economy. And with that, I would end my presentation. Thank you.
Comment, questions? This is fascinating presentation. I think it's becoming a conversation.
That's a revenge.
Yeah, this is we've done this over BFO. We're on now. The 2005 enterprise law. I totally agree with what you said. There were two. So my time sort of being involved in this process a little bit in sort of research and talking with the main players was that there were two other things that were going on that make it a little bit different from the other two periods. One was the simultaneous writing of the unified investment law along with the enterprise law. So while they were doing that, they were also basically putting back a lot of the rent opportunities in the investment law, and they were two different drafting committees that weren't necessarily talking to each other. So it's like, so the political economy issues that you're talking about were really sort of framed by that. And the second issue was there was a discussion right at the beginning of writing that 2005 enterprise law where they said, well, we're going to put the private sector and the foreign sector on the same footing. And then someone said, why don't you put the private sector, foreign sector, and state sector on the same footing? And there was a short discussion about actually including the state sector in that enterprise law. And they decided not to. And then they decided to write a separate state-owned enterprise law that tried to do similar things, but they missed a big opportunity there, I thought. Let me say one little other thing that just to sort of add color or add something that's puzzled me a lot. You know, we talk about the state-owned enterprise sector, and when we do that, we sort of lump together a bunch of different things: the conglomerates, the central state-owned enterprises, the local state-owned enterprises, and the public utilities. But they're actually not the same thing, and they're moving in different directions. So one of the things that's been most fascinating, as you talk about this decentralization issue, is the virtual disappearance of local state-owned enterprises, right? Like one of the reasons the central and state-owned enterprises like Venetian and Vina Lines and Petroleum Mix have been so powerful when they decide to locate in a province is because those local state-owned enterprises that were there before have now been liquidated or equitized or even merged into the central. So I'd just be interested in your take on that, like from the provincial officials' perspective.
That's a great comment and questions. I would like to touch upon the second issue that you mentioned, which is the whether or not to include the SOEs in the unified laws on enterprise. And I talked with the drafting committees, and for the first 7 versions of that law, SOE was out of the law. Right? SOE was intended not to include in the law, so that not to produce an equal footing for the whole business sectors. But then, under the pressure of the WTO, and here WTO, is the moment, is the impetus for putting, own companies together, because, you cannot it cannot discriminate, different types of companies. Once you get into WTO, that is a precondition of, joining WTO. And on the SOEs at the local levels, there's still a significant numbers of SOE as a local number, but you are right. They are among the very first to be equitized. Why? If you look at the budget, the fiscal base of the local provinces in Vietnam, mostly it comes from land. That's the single most important item, right? And then it comes from businesses. And for the provinces like Bình Dương or Đồng Nai, Ho Chi Minh City, and Da Nang, and Vĩnh Phúc, and Hải Dương, and so on, most of that income comes from FDI and private domestic firms. So the state-owned enterprises at the local level don't play the role as you mentioned in your presentation at the central level. Right. So they're subject to equitization at the very beginning because it's considered to be a burden, not a profit. But at the same time, many local provinces, many local governments try to build up some selective state-owned enterprises to become their arms of investment. Định Nghĩa, for example, BKMX, for example, right? And then you can find various, examples of that. So on the one hand, they try to privatize, to equitize those firms which are the burden. But on the other hand, they try to build up other state-owned enterprises so that they can use them as the investment arm or policy arms, in other purposes. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Tu Anh.